Hi all, welcome to Chapter 11, Small Groups and Teams. And what we have here on the first slide is a very efficient and effective group. It is a real-time GIF, so you can definitely see that with coordination, groups can work well. Our focus questions for this chapter are: what are the differences between groups and teams? Why are groups and teams becoming increasingly popular? What are the potential strengths of group discussion? And what are the potential limitations? And to what extent should leadership be assigned to a single member of a group? Let's start off by defining small groups. Wood defines it as 3 or more people who interact over time, depend on one another, and follow shared rules of conduct to reach a common goal. So it's important here that folks are aiming for a common goal, they're interdependent, and so they can't just go off on their own. They have this shared group of rules that they follow, and they do interact over time. The length of that time can vary, however. So one way to think of group size is think of trivia night. So Jeff Bezos of Amazon, he once said that a group should never be larger than what you can feed with 2 pizzas. And trivia night, you think about that ideal size. You've got that person who's really good at sports, the one with movies, that person who seems to know everything about history, the really good person at pop culture, and then that one who knows everything about every Disney movie ever. Right? So I think approximately 5 people. We usually talk of groups as up to about 10 when we're talking about just about small groups, and never smaller than 3. If we go smaller than 3, that's now called a dyad, which is 2 people, and the interactions between 2 people and 3 people are significantly different. So a group is from 3 people up to roughly 10, but again, that top number really varies by situation. It's basically whenever everybody in the group can no longer directly interact with every other person, then you've moved out of a small group. And Wood breaks down for you 6 different types of groups. I'm not going to go through them, but I'm just reminding you what those 6 are so you can make sure you look at them. And those are project teams, focus groups, brainstorming groups, advisory groups, quality improvement teams, and decision-making groups. And each one has its own focus, its own mission, and therefore its own way of going about things. So let's talk about why we would use small groups. So we have small groups and we have large groups. Both count as groups. But there are some benefits to having small versus large, and vice versa. So when you're in a large group, you have a higher number of different perspectives because you have more people. Because you have more different perspectives, you also end up with higher quality decisions because you've looked at even more options. However, the larger a group gets, you also have a higher number of factions, so a number of cliques within the group, people who break off and do their own thing with 1 or 2 others. You have a higher number of non-participants, right? You think about as a class gets larger and larger, and the number of people who sit on their phone and on Facebook and who don't actively partake in the discussion, that number goes up as the class size goes up. So those are all non-participants. Because you have so many folks, your decision-making time goes up, as does your scheduling complexity. Because you have so many different schedules to work with, and you have so many different opinions that you have to take into account. So even though we have higher quality decisions, our productivity is much lower, and it takes much longer to make the decision, and so those are the trade-offs for that. So small groups, obviously, you would flip all of these. You have different perspectives, but not as many. You still can get very good decisions, not as quality as a large group, but you're more productive, fewer scheduling complexities, a shorter decision-making time, more people who are actively participating, and a smaller chance of people breaking off into factions. So I have for you this Dilbert comic. Take a moment, read it over. And often it's very appealing to think about groups this way. There's quite a lot of us who would much rather work on our own and think that that's the most effective. But really, when it comes down to it, the most effective, the most productive, the most collaborative, some of the best results that we get are from groups of 3 to 6 people. And these are groups that are small enough for everybody to take part, to interact with one another, and to really be in it, in the same materials at the same time. And we'll talk later about some of the ways that can go really well or really poorly. But as much as many of us would like to work alone, it is often not the most productive big picture. So collaboration is our goal. Collaboration, it requires cooperation, it requires working together, and really crucially, it requires different skill sets. And that's why groups are so effective, because people are bringing in different skills, different strengths, different perspectives. You end up with innovative and creative solutions that you can't come up with as an individual. When we collaborate with one another, that means that you're supporting both personal and group goals. It's not just one person as the driving force. It's really a very group combined effort. You're making the most of that diversity of strengths, and you're able to utilize more resources because you have those various strengths and those different individuals. Within every group, there are multiple roles that need to be played. Roles are patterns of expected behavior. They can be formal or they can be informal. So if you are declared, you are the note taker or you are the manager, right? Those are formal roles. Formal roles are often those with a title. Think of your name tag. Informal roles, people often pick up kind of, even if you're an employee at the same level of everyone else, often you can become a leader, and that's not necessarily a formal role you take on, but they're ones that just become informally our roles through interaction and through how we behave in the workplace or school or whatever organization that we're with. We have different types of roles. Task roles are those pieces of this is what is happening right now. This is what needs to get done. Maintenance roles are things that are trying to maintain the social cohesion of the group and trying to maintain that actual group dynamic. People get along, people want to work together. And disruptive roles. Disruptive roles are the class clowns. Those are the ones who folks are really egocentric and want things only their own way. So disruptive roles can be either people who are trying to control too much or people who are not willing to take on anything or are getting in the way of everybody else. Role playing is a very fluid process, and it's actually very important that people not become fixated on one role. And that's because the needs of the group change over time. And so if one person at the very beginning says, I am doing this, and I am only doing this, as group time goes on and as the project goes on, that person's role is likely to become pointless, right? They're no longer going to be needed in that role. Instead, you need someone doing something else. So you really need to have this fluid process of who's doing what, when, why, and often people take on the same roles together, or they overlap roles, or you trade off roles over time. When someone gets totally stuck in what their role is, this is called role fixation, and this decreases group effectiveness because you've lost some of the fluidity and some of the strengths and different perspectives that you can use with multiple people. So up in the additional resources, I've posted a link to a quiz. I'm going to apologize in advance for all the ads on it. And it's a quick quiz about what kind of group member are you. It's pretty interesting. You answer 6 questions or so about how you approach groups and how you work in groups. And it gives you a sense of what kind of roles do I fill within groups. Because it's good to try and stretch your boundaries and try out different ones. And make sure they aren't any disruptive roles. So within groups, we have norms, and we've talked about norms a few times now. When we talk about norms with groups, the reason that they exist is because they help groups achieve their goals. These are the rules of the group. So remember that there are both explicit rules and implicit rules. Explicit, maybe you say, we're having a group meeting at this time, everyone is expected to be on time, bring your notes, and phones are away for the first half an hour, right? Those may be all explicit rules if you've stated them. Implicit rules, remember, are more common, and these are all the rules that just happen through interaction. They're the norms that develop the usual habits and that everyone comes to expect but hasn't necessarily said out loud. The primary reason for norms is to try and achieve group goals, as I mentioned, but there's different reasons why people conform to group norms. The 2 main reasons are to be liked and to be right. So when people are the ones who don't want to go by group rules, they're the ones who become outsiders. They're the ones who are labeled as wrong by the rest of the group. A very unfortunate example of people feeling it's very important to conform to group norms is student binge drinking. And so according to the National Institute of AAA, has to do with Alcohol Association, specifically looking at students, approximately 1,825 students per year between the ages of 18 and 24 die due to alcohol consumption or overconsumption. And this is folks trying to conform to uh, the social pressure and the peer groups that are common within college. So I'd like you to take a moment and I'd like you to pause and in your notes, make note of a few groups that you've been a part of, whether it's school or work or other organizations, and I want you to think about what are the norms within that group and label both explicit and implicit norms. Writing down examples is a good way to try and get these ideas and concepts across and to really get them in your brain. Just as there are different types of roles in groups, there's also different types of communication. And if you see the chart on page 235 of the 2014 edition, Wood actually breaks down some more types of information that are in each of these categories that I'm going to talk about. So the first type of communication in groups is task communication. This is communication specifically focused on the ideas, the information, and clarification of those ideas and information. Procedural communication is related to the organization of the group and of the project. The goal here is to extract productivity. Who's supposed to be doing what, at what time, what's our scheduling, right? How are we breaking this down? Climate communication is a social dimension. The goal here is to maintain cohesiveness. The best groups are ones that want to be working together and that actively engage with one another, that are very cohesive. And so it's important to maintain the social dimension of communication in groups. And the fourth type of communication is egocentric. This is communication that is very me-oriented, very individually oriented, and so this is someone who is selfish at the expense of the group. Sometimes it's a person who's completely trying to control the group. Sometimes it's someone who is just goofing off. It's someone who's malicious and trying to screw things up. And there's lots of ways this egocentric communication can go. And of the four types, that egocentric is the one that you do not want. For the best productivity, you actually do want to balance task, procedural, and climate. There are definitely cases where you get too much climate, too much social dimension, and you end up not spending as much time on task and procedural. What studies have found is that those groups that are slightly less productive in the task and procedural and slightly higher in the climate than is ideal is still a group that gets along better and is more productive than a group that is all task and procedural and drops off on the climate. Because if you don't have that cohesion, the task and the procedural pieces are not going to go well. So ideally, you balance all three of those. And it's important to remember that conflict does happen within groups, right? People interact differently, people have different ideas, and because people have different ideas, both for the project itself and for how to go about that project, conflict can actually be very productive for groups, but it does matter how it's being dealt with. So as long as it's recognized as a natural piece of group communication and it's not handled as personal attacks, but instead a moment to step back and try and take a different perspective on any issue, conflict can be very productive for group work. Also important in groups is the idea of power. And we're going to talk about power as the ability to influence, the ability to attain goals. This is the ability for you to attain your goals or for you to influence others' attainment of goals. Power is very relational. So for instance, perhaps in one situation, you have the power, but then you're around different people or a different group, and you're not, right? So it's very relational, as in it depends on the relations with other people. It depends on the situation. And then it's also important to remember that power and this ability to influence is conveyed through the relational dimension of messages. Remember that messages have both a content level and a relationship level. The content level are the words themselves. The relational dimension is what it does for your relationship, what it demonstrates about your relationship. So an example as related to power, let's say you show up at work when you're 5 minutes late, and your boss says to you, "It's really nice to see you today." Now we can take this a few ways. The content here is the words. "It's really nice to see you today." Just the words. The relational level is, what do those words mean? Does it mean you've been late consistently and I've noticed and I'm glad you finally showed up? Or does it mean we get along well and I'm really excited to see you? Right? So those are two very different meanings, even though it's the same content. And you're not going to know the meaning unless you think about the context and the relationship with the person who said it. And because interactions and communication can be ambiguous, it's very possible you actually don't know the reason. And so this is why it's important to be able to talk through misunderstandings and conflict. There are multiple types of power. So we have power over and power to. Power over is the way we often think about the word power, and this is you have power over someone, right? And it's this much stronger, slightly more negative implication. However, ideally, we also have something called power to, and this is empowerment. This is the idea that in a leadership position, you are giving someone the power to do something. You're giving them more and more responsibility to learn how to do the task, to take on the responsibility, and to become empowered to do it themselves, right? And to move out of the position that they're in. Whereas power over is just, I'm going to tell you how it is, I'm going to give you just enough information to accomplish your piece, and I'm going to take the credit for it, is often how power over looks. Power to, often the power, the responsibility, the ability, the skills are given over, and that leader steps back to let that person learn, sometimes make mistakes, but then to learn from those mistakes, and then to take the credit where credit is due. So take a moment to think about who has power in your life, and remember that power here is the ability to influence. Right? So is it your parents, police, teachers, RAs, your older siblings? For me, the baby of the family has a lot of power, more so than I do as the oldest. Your friends, what kind of power do your friends have? What kind of power do you have? So take a minute in your notes and think about, what does it mean that power is the ability to influence attaining goals? What does it mean that it's relational? And how might these various people have power in your life? Over what aspects of your life? Wood talks about the 5 bases of power. So there are 5 bases through which people often attain power, become leaders. And leaders and power are not necessarily the exact same thing. So we can gain power, both power to and power over. There are a couple different ways. One of which is expert power. And this is the idea that you are an expert in this topic. You know what there is to know. You are the person someone comes to for information. You're the one who's been researching this for years. Legitimate power says somebody has named you as an authority. You are named as the President of the United States. You are named as CEO. You are named as hall monitor, right? Someone has named you into that position of authority, and your power comes from having been named, basically. Reward power is someone has the power to do nice things for you, to give you praise, to give you that pat on the back, and those things go a long way in a workplace. To give you a raise, right? To give you candy, whatever that reward might be for you. Reward is very broadly considered, but reward power. And the flip side of reward power is coercion, also known as punishment. So someone who can take away that candy, take away that raise, get you suspended, any of those things, that's coercion or punishment power. And then the last, I feel like, is the one folks have the most difficult time remembering, and this is called referent power. You also seen it called charisma. And this is that person who you really look up to, and you want them to think well of you, you want to emulate them, and so this is a person who you really honor and value, and it's for that reason that they have power. So, we've been talking about power and I'm having you make some notes. I'd like you to pause a moment and for each of these 5 bases of power, think about a person in your life that has each type of power over you. And it's important to remember that it's possible that the same person fits into several categories, or maybe all of them. So, for instance, when I was in graduate school, my PhD advisor is basically the person who runs your life for several years. They determine when you get time off, what you're doing, how you're doing it. There's a lot of pieces of your life they control. But you often choose an advisor as someone who's in the same area of study that you're interested in and who has knowledge that you care about, and they are very much an expert in what you want to do. And so they have that expert power because they are a researcher and they have put so much time and effort into that area that you're interested in. And so your advisor, my advisor, had expert power. My advisor also has legitimate power, being named as a faculty member and a professor when I was only a graduate student, being named as my teacher, and being named as my advisor gives them very particular roles and very particular abilities in relationship to my school career. My professor and advisor definitely had reward power in the sense of writing me letters to get me jobs, to get me grants, giving me grades, passing me, right? All of those things are reward power. But they also had coercion power that said, no, you're not ready, right? You need to stay another year, or you need to redo this paper, or, here's a grade that you aren't quite happy with. Those are all coercion power. And then also for my advisor, there was very definitely referent power. I chose my advisor not only because of her area of expertise, but also because it was a person who I respected, and both on a personal and a professional level. And so it was someone that I wanted to like me, and someone that I wanted to be able to emulate some of the things that she had achieved. And so for me, I'm able to name one person who fits all 5 of these bases of power. When we think about power in groups, it's inevitable that we think about leadership. So it's important to remember that yes, leaders there might be one person in a group who takes more of that leadership role, but more productively and more effectively, leaders are not simply one person in the group. People trade off aspects of leadership. If someone's not there, someone else picks up the slack, right? Different people, play off their strengths, and maybe one person's really the leader when it comes to that social dimension, while others are more leader-based when it comes to the task dimension. So I've laid out here some of the different aspects that come into leadership and excellence, and these are by no means limited to one person. So, although we have so many ups of groups, there are some downs. We'll talk about both of those. An up in groups is this idea of synergy. And synergy is also called the group genius effect. And I know a lot of folks have heard this term before. So synergy, the way we talk about it most often is in this very positive group genius effect. It's more likely to happen with cooperation and with what we call deep diversity. Deep diversity is when you have several members of the group and everyone's bringing in very different skills, talents, resources, and so you can really tap into some very different aspects of thinking and creativity. And what synergy means is that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so if you've ever been part of a synergistic meeting up, it's really fun. You play off each other and you bounce ideas and you come up with something that none of you could have done individually, because individually you didn't have enough knowledge or enough of the resources in particular areas. But then when you combine all of those, you end up with this really cool result that none of you could have gotten to on otherwise. So that's an upside of groups. A downside of groups is what we call groupthink. Groupthink is negative. And what happens with groupthink? When you have a group that very highly values conformity, they discourage disagreements, there's no set decision-making structure, and there's likely some competition with other groups, you end up with what I refer to as beyond bad results. Right? This is where you get a group together and they're on track with this idea and no one is willing, or everyone is even discouraged from, stepping back and saying, is this the right decision? Is this the right track? Are we doing what we need to be doing? So this really demonstrates the importance of a devil's advocate role. I strongly suggest that folks have a very specific devil's advocate for every meeting, for every project, and that you trade that role off. The role of the devil's advocate is to not totally bash everybody's ideas, but to take a step back and just say, that's a really interesting idea. Why that one, right? What are the benefits of it? What are the limitations of it? Is it what's best suited to this moment? So the devil's advocate forces you to step back and evaluate all of your ideas, right, before you move forward down a track and get too far. I recommend trading off the devil's advocate role because it can be very difficult to be one person constantly questioning and constantly challenging, even if it's a gentle challenge, because inevitably people are going to step back and say, just let it go. Just let us do this. So it's important to trade off this role because it very much is a role that you want to consistently have within a group. The reason for this is that if you do get into a situation of groupthink, there can be, in some cases, deadly results. So, for instance, the 1986 Challenger shuttle explosion is one of the very classic examples of groupthink. What happened is lots of groups, lots of people work on the various parts of shuttles, and they were coming up to a deadline, and things needed to get finished, and there was a group working on rubber O-rings, and they knew they weren't quite ready, but the deadline was there. They were competing with other groups, and they knew they just needed to get it done, and they were gonna lose face. They were gonna be embarrassed if they didn't get it done in time. And so what happened is the rubber O-rings that they ended up producing failed at low temperatures, and so the seal to a fuel rocket leaked, and shortly after takeoff, the Challenger shuttle exploded in the air on national television, killing all 7 members aboard, including an elementary school teacher whose class was watching. Right, so this one small rubber O-ring, and I believe that's actually the size of it in the image there, resulted in a national tragedy because of groupthink. So although this is an extreme example, it is one of the classic examples of groupthink because what seems like a small decision in the moment to just keep forging ahead can have profound impact. One of the really positive elements of groups are teams. So all teams are groups. Not all groups are teams. A team is a type of group that is inherently we-oriented, has high levels of cooperation and high levels of cohesiveness. They possess diverse skills among members, and they have a very strong group identity amongst themselves. So the more team-like a group is, the more effective they are. A suggestion for helping encourage team orientation is to really work on that social function, right, where people really feel a sense of commitment and interdependence with one another, but also to develop a limited number of clearly stated goals. These goals should be challenging to members. They should have to encourage cooperation, so you actually have to be interdependent and work with one another on the goals, on the project. And members have to actually be committed to achieving them. If members don't care about the final product, it's unlikely you're going to achieve team status, which the reason it's more productive and more efficient is because folks are committed to each other and to the project, and it makes for a very productive time and meeting. So you'll be working in groups throughout the semester, and so I'd like you to, amongst yourselves, develop group contracts. I've laid out some of this information in the communication climate page on the website, but have a chat with each other and figure out what are some of the explicit roles of our group. How are we going to communicate with one another? How often? When do we have to reply by? Are we having meetings, even if they're online meetings, right? What's that attendance look like? I've had some groups in the past that says if you don't show up to a meeting, next time you do, you bring pizza or Starbucks for everybody. It's a little bit harder to do in the online environment, but do think about kind of what does it look like to attend, and is there any result for not doing so? Workmanship, right? If everyone says, I want to get an A, make sure you know what that looks like for everybody. Do you each do your work in the same way? Does that final product, do you have the same expectations for it? Think about group roles, right? Actually look in the text and look in the extra resources and determine what are some of the roles we can take on. What are the roles I often take on? How might I expand those? Do we need to trade some off, such as the devil's advocate? If conflict comes up, how are we going to handle it? Right? So going to the instructor is the last thing on the list. It is an option, but you do have to try and handle the conflict internally in at least two ways, right? So you kind of have a tiered system of, okay, you're late this time, here's what's going to happen. Oh, you did it again, and you obviously don't care, right? Here's the next thing. And then bringing me in as a mediator is kind of the last option there. And think about, is there anything else that you want to address within your group?